Before starting my next mission, I was given a surprisingly high amount of safety briefings. I found this interesting since I had brought back far more than what was expected, to include answering what happened to the lost man we had. It didn't hit me until I listened really close, where I believe I might have got into trouble as soon as I got there. Had to stop the briefing and call El Doctor to clarify what the hell was going on. I had a rough idea, but I wasn't sure until I finally got the new details from him. To put it simply, I was being sent to see what the CRISPR experiments would create. Kicker is that one cannot just make a decision to start these experiments, but they have to start the process with full commitment to complete the experiment. Now, I had figured that they had already figured it all out by now. Seriously, they have had this tech for decades now, and it's not perfected? Seriously? Once the decision is made and the jumper is sent to the future, samples will fade into nothing since they didn't exist in the future timeline anymore. This is a time jumper's biggest fear, that one day they will just fade because someone screwed up your past. Since we have multiple jumpers, this is always a possibility. However, there is only two that are cleared to jump to the past. To my knowledge, one has gone back since I started the job. The only bonus is that recordings and data remain always. Since I'm already on the subject, I'll just say it. One of my colleagues was not always the person I know. In fact, she was he at one timeline, I guess you could say. Now, looking at recordings on the way he acted made me realize that they were definitely raised very similar. Mannerisms were very similar, and of course, no one could miss that Northwestern accent. The true major difference was that she was he, and then he was a bit pudgy in the midsection and a bit of a short man. Not really short, but about 5'7", but it was a big difference from the nearly 6 foot tall her version. Her weight was carried mainly up high and down low, as though she just needed some maintenance and she would have been on the edge of stunning. They both had the same hair and eye color, so seeing the similarities was very easy. It turned out that her, their father was very strict on education and basically forced them to study the same thing. It was lucky that both of them had a knack for the subject. I hate to say it, but I think they kept the female version just to have something nice to look at. Though once someone found out that the other version of her, it turned a lot of the guys away. I felt bad considering it all. Don't tell her, but I asked to go into her past and make her marry that colleague crush she mentioned to me once. No dice, due to the very high risk of temporal destability. A fancy cover for "We don't want you to risk our progress." And just remember, we pay the bills. Now back to where I was before I get a little sidetracked. This time, when I got my load out for the jump, I was handed a long gun to take with me. It wasn't anything to sneer at either. It was a fully modified Scar Heavy, set with all my specifications. The ammo was no joke either, with some pretty nasty chemicals in them. Let's just say anything penetrated would have about 10 steps before their body just gives out and collapses. Most of it was hemotoxin, similar to that of some venomous snakes. This made me ask if I would have to pick up, or maybe have some backup. Nope. Still don't know why they insist on single-man missions. It was driving me crazy. Once again, the jump itself was very uneventful. It still tingles, but it doesn't tickle anymore. I had to take a minute to get my bearings since I had jumped pretty far away from the target building. Actually, that is a lie. It was over a day's walk from the target building, and it would have some serious questions about what the hell happened. Though lucky me, half of my equipment had shorted out, so the tech being able to figure out what happened would be difficult at best. This is why it's good to be the guy like me. Even though I was given a lot of shit for bringing it, the map and compass were worth more than their weight in gold at this point. I would have just used the GPS, but it was barely able to stay on for more than a minute. I was also grateful that I had my old pocket watch. You can guess what happened to the wristwatch. Yeah, zap. I didn't even check the cameras until a few hours later when I stopped for a little break. Out of the 6 cameras, only 2 were still functioning. Wonderful! As I walked through the forest, I was glad that it was late summer and the temperature was comfortable. Though, had it been a little cooler, I wouldn't have had to stop for water. And thanks to the iodide pills I always carry, I didn't have to stop for very long. The forest was still, which I didn't notice at first, but there was no breeze and no noise. My fast pace made enough noise to be heard for about 50 meters, but nothing that would scare off every bird and insect. Hell, I didn't even see any squirrels. This had me on the edge trying to find any signs of life. Now, I know it's against survival code to run, unless you're being chased, but I wanted to get the fuck out of that forest as fast as I could. I got my bearings and was almost at a full run for the next hour at least. I had to be moving far faster than I had thought because before nightfall I could see the target house across the fields. I tried turning on my flashlight, but ended up dropping it since it had been fired out too. As I reached the edge of the field, I started calling out. If you've ever lived in a rural neighborhood, let's just say it's a very good idea to let people know you're coming. I was about halfway across the field when I heard something. It sounded like thunder and seemed to roll for over a minute. I quickened my pace as I got closer, but not wanting to get stuck in the weather after all this. I kept yelling even as the porch lights came on. I started waving my hands to get their attention as 2 men stepped out the door. They were obviously father and son, and both armed with shotguns. They saw me and started to draw up until they saw the gear I was wearing. Jumping this far into the future has its perks, I guess. Like not getting shot by people you were sent to meet. That's when I could see absolute fear in their eyes. They both drew up as lightning started flashing behind me. It was bright and blue, so I figured it was heat lightning. That is until I heard something screaming. I turned and saw the forest seem to come alive. It was as though several different creatures came bolting through the wood line under the cover of the night. I sure as hell wasn't going to stand there in an open lane and find out what the hell it was. Turning around, I bolted to the house. That is when I felt the air next to me pull so hard I almost lost my balance. It sounded like something had flew right past me in the air, but it was too much in a hurry that I didn't give a shit. When I was about to reach the porch, I found out what had gone past me. The father wasn't holding a shotgun. He was holding a coil gun and aiming it across the field. For those that don't know what they think a rail gun or a gauze rifle for you science fiction folks is, instead of using actual chemicals to burst a projectile out, instead it uses long metal rails and magnetism to launch the projectile that was with an electrified coil in the barrel. It's lighter, more efficient, and far easier to use. I went to climb the steps when I realized there weren't any. The son simply reached down and pulled me up the 3 feet onto the porch. He didn't even seem to strain, even with all my gear on. They ushered me inside, where the mother and her young daughter were cooking dinner as though they didn't have a care in the world. Shocked, I apologized for being so late and quickly asked what the hell was in the forest. Long story short, the CRISPR program worked, but there were some side effects. Since it was only designed for humans, other animals had issues. The forest around the area was now a quarantine zone while they figured out how to take care of those things without nuking half of the state into glass. The creatures are not very active during the day and almost never come close to humans, but they will consume anything in their territory once they do become active. The coil gun is enough to scare them back into the forest and kill even the biggest ones if necessary. After setting up my gear, I sat and talked about what happened. Well, here's the short version, since we were quite literally up all night talking. Due to the solar maximum messing up the food, several of the groups tried to capitalize on it, and this only made things so much worse. Even with all the strife, certain groups and nations tried to secure as many resources they could get their grubby little mitts on. Enter World War III, at least sort of. You see, it wasn't fought over vast areas of land, though that did happen. The majority of the conflict went across vast oceans. At first, it was smaller states jumping into the fray early on, but the major players didn't get involved until actual incursions into their land had occurred. I'm sure was out of desperation, but the resulting conflict began to destroy the remainder of the food reserves and farmable land. This accelerated the CRISPR program, and when whistleblowers went public, it was on. The results for humans were far greater than expected. Not only did it allow them to engage in photosynthesis so that they didn't have to eat nearly as much, but it also increased them in other areas. Most males ended up having increased strength due to the muscles becoming more insectoid. This also made their skeletons much more dense, as though their bones were webbed from their own carapace or something. Females are hyper aware of their surroundings to the point that they can sense anything in a particular radius. Everyone's vision got far better, along with their reflexes and metabolism. All four of them were quite lean, something I didn't realize at first. They were all just around better. At least, that's what I thought. There was a single side effect that no one joked about. Even though it seemed as though someone could live much longer, the birth rates around the world are in the shithouse. The father was very grim as he explained how the populace needs to reproduce at a rate of 2.1 to maintain. The current global birth rate is 0.3. I had to pick up my jaw on that one. I asked if that was the reason no one wants to hunt the monsters. They just nodded as they looked away. I kept thinking this was insane. How did the dominoes fall this way? I know everything will change when I jump back, but the prospect of this being our future made my blood run ice cold. I didn't have much time to contemplate it, though. There was a slight rumbling outside, and the family was in sudden fear as the house suddenly shook. Something had hit it, and really hard. The entire thing seemed to shake to the foundation. I looked out the window, and the sun had begun to rise. I got to my feet and looked out the window from where the impact was and started cursing up at the storm. That thing that was about to chase me down the night before had come to the house and was now trying to ram its way in. The women ran upstairs, and the men grabbed their weapons. The son was the first one to fire at the foot-long metal spike from the coil gun that stuck into the back of this thing. The father fired his spike, deflecting off the thing's carapace. I was almost dumbstruck at this thing. It had to be half the size of an 18-wheeler, with 6 primary legs and massive mandibles coming out of its head. The back of it was covered with some shell similar to that of a turtle, though it was difficult to tell since it was mostly covered in dirt and small plants. I finally shook off my initial gaze and raised my rifle. The father yelled, "Stop!" as I fired off a few rounds. The creature recoiled a little, and I tried to line up another shot when I felt something fall against my leg. The 2 men were on the ground holding their heads, clearly in a lot of pain. I didn't have time to think about it as this thing was attacking the house and it had recovered, and then it had extended its head along with its mandibles and that beak-like face. Yeesh. I simply emptied the rest of the magazine into its open mouth as it came forward. As I reloaded, I backed up in case I needed more room. As I did, I saw that the 2 men were quickly crawl back inside the house into other rooms. Alone, I proceeded to keep shooting this thing until I stopped moving. This took about 2 more magazines, but it was worth it. I withdrew into the house, where the mother was treating both of the men for bleeding from their ears. She began to chew me out as she patched them up. The little girl was on the stairs, still holding her own head. Between expletives, she explained that due to the upgrades, human hearing was far more sensitive, to the point that firing a rifle was just as bad as them firing artillery next to their head. I couldn't help what happened, and she didn't want to hear my excuses as she told me to leave while she continued to pack them up. It was all right because I had the job to do anyway. I went out and began to cut pieces off of that thing and put them into bags in order to bring them back. It was a very messy operation. Up close, this thing looked like some sort of amalgamation of at least 20 different animals. I got what I could, but only had so many bags, or, or room in my pack for that matter. When I was wiping blood off my knife, the mother came out and she was much more composed. She offered me a cup of coffee as she explained that most of the time these big ones stay underground. They only come out if they sense a food source, which made this one's action seem a little weird. Though if it had tried for the barn, it would have received 250,000 volts for its effort. Confused, she was still a little mad that I had shot it, at least until I showed her the spike that had been penetrating this creature. It only went about 3 to 4 inches into it. I explained how it probably wasn't kinetic weapons that took this thing down, but the poison in the bullets. This made me wonder why this thing's blood hadn't coagulated like it should have. I didn't care anymore, though. I just wanted to wrap up this mission and get the hell back. Oh, and while I'm thinking of it, Back to the Future references got way too old, way too fast, so please just don't. We jumpers use them only as a type of code to not freak out the tech folks. We need them focused. I said my goodbyes and walked out into the field where I normally would jump in and out. When I got there, I gave the house one last look, and as I hit the retrieval beacon, I saw something move in the distance. Another one of those things was coming out of the forest. This one had longer legs and moved much faster. I only got to see it for a few moments before the gate opened and I was shot across the room. I only got a quick look as I came flying through the gate with enough inertia to slide into the far wall. Really, and I mean really hard. Still don't know how I didn't break every single bone in my body. I was rushed into the aid station and got checked out. Tex, along with other personnel, followed me in. Some grabbed my bag full of samples, while others grabbed my cameras, all while others were screaming for answers. Me? I was just trying to make sure all my joints were still in place and my bones had not turned to gravel as I screamed. It was about a week in bed for observation with constant debriefings. I figured that was going to be the case when most of the cameras went to hell. At that point, I was just glad I didn't have to eat through a tube. A few of the other junkers came to see me. They let me know that any long range jumps had been put on hold. Reasons? Unknown. In fact, all jumps were on standby until further notice. Apparently, the lab folks were going crazy with the samples I had brought back. One joked how I was the only one in the entire wing that would be getting any sleep. I tried to laugh, but it kind of hurt too much to go above a chuckle. Looks like I was going to get a bonus, too. Hey, I'll take the wins where I can get them. I kept asking them how my equipment had malfunctioned so spectacularly, but no one had an answer. If the techs had figured it out, they weren't telling anybody, or at least not one of us. Though the biggest surprise was when El Doctor visited me and stayed for about 2 hours just talking. He told me that the stuff that had made those creatures was being defunded so it couldn't happen. I smiled even though I didn't believe him for a second. I'm sure he wanted just me to make, feel at ease a little bit more. Due to this last haul, I was now the most successful jumper in my unit, and I'm sure they wanted to keep things as profitable as possible. I listened to him talk more candidly about what might be coming down the pipe, different technologies and political games, things of that nature. It wasn't until he left that I was able to think about it, that I realized they didn't know the conflict was going to start. Maybe I should let that one just play out. Besides, if they want, they can change it if they can, if they want to. I mean, hell. I was out of that bed a week later, but I was still under observation for a while. All that time, I wondered if the family I left in the future was going to be all right. Maybe that thing was just after me and left them alone. Maybe it would go to the barn and get fried on the fence. I don't know. The only thing I do know is about 2 weeks after I was out on observation and there were jumps scheduled. I looked and it wasn't on for a few months. Guess they figured I earned some time off. Going to head to the house and maybe go visit family. Until my next jump, I just wanted to relax. Though you can't always get what you want. When the phone rings, you need to answer it. This time, it was a text message. Well, looks like it's time to make another jump.